Hello and welcome to Thank God It's Friday. The Indian markets have rallied 2.5% this week to record highs, driven by Prime Minister Modi's victory in India's largest state. And to discuss the impact of the changing political landscape, we're being joined by Alastair Newton, the co-founder and director of Alavan Business Advisory. Thank you for your time, Alastair. What are your thoughts on the political developments in India, especially with Modi's demonetization drive and his consequent win in the local state elections?
Well, I think overall, despite the results in Goa and Punjab, the results in the recent state elections were a big booster for the BJP. And clearly, as far as UP in particular is concerned, a big vote of confidence in Narendra Modi himself, given the amount of personal time and attention he devoted to the campaign there. Anecdotally, to go to your point about demonetization, anecdotally, my understanding is that although many poorer Indians were inconvenienced by the demonetization, a lot of those in UP at least felt that it was overall a good thing. It demonstrated Modi's decisiveness. It demonstrated his determination to battle against tax avoidance and corruption. And I think in the end, despite the criticism of demonetization, which there has been in much of the press, not only in India itself, but internationally, I think in the end, BJP has to an extent at least been vindicated insofar as my personal view, as I've said on many occasions since the 9th of November when I happened to be in Mumbai, I think overall there was a clear link between the timing of the demonetization, the timing of the budget, and these regional elections. I think the timing was very political indeed, and it has served the BJP well. As things stand today, still 2 years, of course, before the next general election has to be held. I think overall, though, BJP is set fair for the next general election, not least because it's hard to see where the opposition would come from. Congress had another series of disappointing results, and AAP also did less well than many had expected. So BJP is way out there in front as far as national standing in India is concerned today. I'll pause there.
Right. So, Alastair, my next question is to do with the course going forward, because now that the Modi government has such a strong mandate with itself, do you think that going on from here, they will be a little less reformist and they will take up populist measures in order to prepare for 2019 general elections?
Well, I think there's always a problem at the moment with reform. Because, as you know, for all of its big majority in the Lok Sabha, the BJP still does not have an upper house majority and will not have an upper house majority before 2019 at the earliest, if we look at the regional elections, which are scheduled to take place between now and then. So passing legislation is always going to involve compromises. It's always going to involve a certain amount of dilution in order to get deals done. So I'm actually not expecting a huge amount of legislated reform between now and 2019, simply because of the impracticalities of pushing stuff through quickly without an upper house majority. What I am expecting to see is a good deal more fixed asset investment. I think we are going to see a boost in fixed asset investment even from the levels we've seen recently. If you want to call that populist, you certainly can, with some justification, but I think you could also, with at least equal, if not more justification, regard it as being justified and necessary supply-side investment with positive longer-term consequences for the Indian economy, as well as the shorter-term booster to GDP growth. And all other things being equal, I think what I would have to say is we are likely to see an uptick in GDP growth in the second half of this year. Obviously, to a certain extent, that revolves around the monsoon. But I do think all other things being equal, we're going to see a bounce back from the slight slowdown we've seen as a result of demonetization. The Indian economy is in pretty good shape. You have a very good central bank, which is doing an excellent job on countering inflationary pressures and so on. And everything seems to look pretty good from here today. I should add, I would also expect to see equities doing reasonably well. And I do think we are likely to see rupee strengthening against a basket of currencies. It's an open question, of course, as to what rupee dollar does, given that we have a certain amount of interest in where the dollar's going in the rest of this year as well. But I think overall, things look pretty fair. One further point I would mention, which I think is quite important in the context of India, in the last 10 days, we have seen the price of oil slump by around about 10%. And clearly, given the amount of energy which India imports these days, a lower oil price is also good for India, the Indian economy, and for, of course, the Indian Finance Ministry.
Okay, so, we know that the Prime Minister Modi has had good relations with the U.S. President Obama, the former U.S. President Obama. But how do you think the relations will pan out between Modi and Donald Trump, keeping in mind trade between the two countries, what Donald Trump has in mind, and perhaps to a certain extent, the terrorism that's been plaguing the Indian subcontinent?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to say in the broad before I get to the specifics of the Modi-Trump relationship. First of all, it's not entirely clear by any means exactly what is going to happen in detail as far as the US policy agenda is concerned. It's what I've described in a paper I wrote recently as the war in the White House. Now, some experts will legitimately, I think, say that there are 8 different factions around Donald Trump fighting for influence over the president. I think, personally, as far as the important ones are concerned, I would narrow it down to 3 factions. The first is what one might call the Breitbart faction, that is the right-wing nationalists, led by Steve Bannon, of course, and clearly, to go to your point about trade, Peter Navarro, Trump's trade guru, is part of that faction, at least as far as economic nationalism is concerned. The second is the group which is known in Washington, at least behind President Trump's back, as the adults or the grown-ups. And basically there I'm talking about the likes of Mattis and Mnuchin, the people who actually have, shall we say, a realist view of the world and realpolitik, and I would include the new National Security Advisor, McMaster, in that as well. And probably also Tillerman, the Secretary of State. Now, clearly, they have a somewhat different perspective to the Bannons of this world. And the third, and perhaps the most influential, is what you could actually say is the family, by which I mean Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. Now, it's not clear where the balance is going to come down among those people at this stage, and clearly that does stand to have an impact on relations between the US and India as well. The second point I would make is to look at it from the opposite end of the spectrum, and that is to look at it from the Indian end of the spectrum. Now, India is not highly dependent on exports of manufactured goods for its economic well-being. It is big enough to have a lot of self-containment economically, and I think in the emerging market firmament, generally speaking, India stands to do relatively well if some of the worst things which Donald Trump has threatened in terms of trade protectionism do happen to come about. I think that the Indian economy is more robust than a good deal of other emerging markets and less susceptible to US protectionism, with one notable exception, of course, and that is the whole issue of visas. Now, so far, of course, I need to qualify this by saying that so far Donald Trump has shown no interest in trying to get jobs back to the US in areas such as business processing, where India clearly has enormous strengths and where any effort to take jobs back to America would be damaging to India. Now, having set the context, let me come very much to your question. I actually think that Trump and Modi will get on extremely well. Trump clearly has a liking for strongman leaders, and Narendra Modi is a strongman leader by any reasonable definition of the word. Trump clearly has a big focus on China, and in common with US presidents before him, in which I'm thinking particularly of George W. Bush, is likely to think that India, as the world's biggest democracy is a convenient ally for the world's largest democracy in any struggle against China, not recognizing that, at least in my view, India will very much make its own way in its relations with China and do what is best for India and not necessarily what is best for the United States. And the third thing I would say, of course, and you rightly pointed to this, is the whole question of Islamic terrorism, which is a domestic problem in India, as you know, but which is perhaps even more of a problem relative to one of your neighbors. And as far as that is concerned, I think a great deal will depend on where the US comes down under Donald Trump in its future engagement in Afghanistan, and that, of course, is a big unknown at this stage too.
Okay. Talking about or moving on to global trade dynamics, after America exited from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, do you think China could sort of step in to form its own Trans-Pacific Partnership version, and what could that exit from TPP mean for India's exports as compared to Asian nations?
I don't think the demise of TPP in itself has significant implications for India. I think the first part of your question is much more relevant, and that is what may follow the collapse of the TPP negotiations. And here I think we need to look to an existing process which revolves around the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which, as you no doubt know, is a semi-dormant, I think would be the right word to describe it, trade negotiation involving the members of ASEAN and the countries with which ASEAN already has bilateral trade agreements. So clearly of great significance to India. If we go back to Xi Jinping's speech in Davos in January, it is clear that he is looking to seize advantage from the demise of TPP and the general uncertainty surrounding US policy in Asia as a whole, consequent of Trump's election. He is looking to take advantage in setting China up as a regional leader and as a promoter of free trade. Now, having said that, we need to think carefully about what China means by free trade. In pursuing RCEP, China is not going to be looking to build the sort of advanced market access beyond borders trade agreement which TPP would have been had it become a reality. Rather, it's going to be looking at a more traditional GATT-style, tariff-related, trades in goods-related trade agreement. So by no means state-of-the-art. And I do think we need to keep in mind, too, that if anything, China's attitude towards trade is still somewhat mercantile. Finally, I think there is a fairly compelling amount of evidence to suggest that Xi Jinping is looking to build a liberal regional trade order on the basis of illiberal domestic regimes. And that doesn't quite fit the Indian model either, where you have a very powerful and thriving and healthy democracy in stark contrast to China. So in any future trade agreements in the region with which China and India are involved, India is certainly going to face challenges getting an agreement which works for India. But I do think China will pursue this agenda following the collapse of TPP, and I do think the ASEAN countries in particular are going to be looking to find some sort of substitute for TPP, which does inevitably involve China.
All right, and so finally, coming down to Europe, we know the Netherlands has chosen in favor of the incumbent party right now, but there is the matter of France and Germany in general elections, which may be a little more critical to the stability of the Eurozone. Should leaders like Marine Le Pen emerge as winners, what are the risks that capital markets yet may have to account?
Well, let's just deal very quickly with Germany first, because that is fairly straightforward. The chances of an anti-European party winning the election in Germany or even being part of a government in Germany is not high. And if it is going to be an anti-European party which is involved in a government in Germany, it's going to be Die Linke, the left-wing former communists, not Alternative für Deutschland, the populist nationalist some would say right-wing party. The next Chancellor of Germany is almost certainly going to be either Angela Merkel or Martin Schulz, now the Chancellor candidate for the SPD. And of course, Schulz is even more pro-European, pro-EU, pro-Euro than Angela Merkel is. So I don't think we need to worry too much about Germany at this stage. And I guess that's why you quite rightly addressed your question principally to France. Now, if Marine Le Pen were elected president of France, which is a non-negligible probability, but still a good deal less than 50% if we look at opinion polls and other factors today, the first challenge she would face is actually going to be in the National Assembly elections, which follow just a few weeks later, because there is nothing to suggest that her party, the Front National, is actually capable of winning a majority in the National Assembly. And without a majority in the National Assembly, she is going to find it very, very hard indeed to call a referendum on France's membership of either the Euro or the European Union. There are mechanisms by which she could do it, but it would involve going through the constitutional courts. It would be very similar to something which Charles de Gaulle had to do back in, I think it was 1958, in order to change France's constitution to allow him to establish the Fifth Republic. This is not an easy process by any means, but the mere fact of Le Pen being elected is certainly going to send a shockwave, or would certainly send a shockwave through financial markets, through Europe. It will be very hard for the Germans, whoever their chancellor is, to work with Le Pen, and it could still spell very bad news for the future well-being of the Euro and the European Union, even if she were unable to organise a referendum. So this is certainly an election which we need to watch very, very closely indeed. Right now, Emmanuel Macron is certainly the favourite to win the election. I think the assumption is that François Fillon will not withdraw before the final day for nominations, which is tomorrow, the 17th. There is still a provision whereby he could withdraw thereafter, and the election would then probably be postponed for several weeks to allow a new candidate time to gather momentum. And clearly that could change the equilibrium significantly. But for the time being, I think we can reasonably assume that we are most likely looking at a four-horse race, Le Pen, Macron, Fillon, and one should not totally discount Hamon for the Socialist Party if he were able to cobble together some sort of electoral pact with the extreme left-wing candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but that looks pretty unlikely as things stand. And all the evidence to date is pointing to a Le Pen-Macron runoff, and although some supporters of Fillon's party may then defect to Marine Le Pen, and some from the extreme left may then vote for Marine Le Pen, it does look like Macron would win by a clear margin in those circumstances. But keep in mind, we've seen many surprising twists in this election campaign so far. We can't rule out further twists in the story between now and the second round at the end of April. Early May.
Well, I certainly do agree with you there, Alastair. Well, but that is all that we have for you. Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure.